physically I can do so. Stream- Okay, yeah. Good. Okay, so I think we're live or streaming. So my name's Cory Fisher. I am the archivist and publications director here for the foundation. I came 5 years ago and was engaged in the residential student program and then continued on as staff. So I've been here and been a part of the place for a few years. So today we're gonna together go through Freedom from the Known, Krishnamurti's perspective. I have a few caveats to that, and we'll sort of introduce the whole presentation by going through my own process and putting this whole thing together. Although I've read and listened to many Krishnamurti talks, this is the first time I've ever taken more of a scholarly approach. So looking specifically at something like freedom from the known in terms of the full body of his work and extracting what I can that I think is important to build a presentation. So what that means is that you're getting there's a bit of me in this that is my disclaimer, and also that I have a personal interest in this. So I've made a lot of notes to keep myself on track and to kind of guide how we move through this. One thing I think is interesting, so as the archivist, I have access to a lot, and it made it easy in terms of being able to look at everything, but to give you an idea of what one can look at in terms of the full body of the archive. If you pull up words like freedom and free, you get over 36,000 results. So that's basically the full body of transcripts of these talks. These words, these concepts, these ideas are mentioned quite a bit, and there are common threads throughout, but there are also things that seem to contradict themselves just in terms of the teachings or the work. Whether or not they are actual contradictions is a conversation we can have, but the idea is just sort of to extract what we feel is really the essence of what it means to be free from the known. And I do think that after really looking at this, that freedom from the known, you could really look at that as an essential component of what Krishnamurti was speaking about. So we're not going to touch everything by any means of what he spoke about, and I intentionally did not include certain things that he spoke about because I felt we wouldn't have the time to unpack them, to give them their due respect, so to say. So we really are looking at a subset of his teachings, but I think we're looking at a critical component of them, and one that really is the essence of them, and one that I hope really pertains exactly to what he was saying, which is it's about our lives and about the way that we live our lives, and that freedom from the known is not something abstract or not something that we have to relate to in some philosophical sense, but that there's some real reality to what that means. So this presentation somehow is like, how do we unpack that in a real way, and what does that mean for us really? So just to give an overview, and I realize that there's some disorder in how these things, but a little disorder is the reality of things. So I'm going to start with why. Why do we ask this question? And that's a little bit out of order in terms of how Jaap presented these questions: why, what, and how. I think it's interesting to start with why, because I think it can ground us in why we consider these things important. What kind of mind asks a question, why be free from the known? So I think there's something about asking this question in the first place that gives us some clues into what's really meant by this question. And that was interesting just in terms of looking into this and putting this together. Being free from the known can be many different things, and it really depends on how one's looking and the quality of a mind that looks at this question. And it seems that ultimately freedom from the known is a kind of question that's in a class. It's a class of questions that's different than most of the questions we ask about ourselves, because it's a question that's about the structure of ourselves directly. So it's not a question of who or what we think we should be, but it's a question of the very structure of what we are and how that interacts with the world. So in that sense, it's a very different question than it may appear to be. So there's this, it's an interesting way to look at it that way also. So I'll start with why, and then we'll move to the known and freedom. So we'll unpack what Krishnamurti means by these terms and look at the different elements of these things. And then, as Jaap in his introduction pointed out, we'll look at the hows, even though they may not be hows, the elements that seem to be part of this freedom, or to bring this freedom about. And then we'll break and open up for questions and all that. Again, I've made notes, so forgive me if I bow my head and figure out where I am. So first we'll look at why. So, freedom from the known. I've sort of taken little elements of Krishnamurti's teachings and generalized them quite a bit, just to sort of ground us in why we would ask this question, and to sort of give us, I hope, to give us a sense of why it's important for us ourselves. So again, it's in terms of the presentation, but also in terms of this conference generally, there can be, alongside a scientific and philosophical component, hopefully there's another component which is more intimate to us. This somehow, and I think this is why we're all here, somehow there's something that's important to us, that in our daily lives, this question is a real one. In some sense, there's a reality to this question that goes beyond philosophizing about how one should live, but on the ground, in daily life, what is the activity of our lives? So, to start, we take conflict for granted. So, to move into that a bit more, and why that's a part of why, conflict is something that, in general, seems to be the basis for a lot of the activity of our lives, both internally and externally. So internally, what conflict looks like is I am angry or jealous, or I'm not quite what I want to be. So there's something in me that is uneasy, and something in me that is unresolved, and a part of me fights against that or strives towards something that moves in a direction. And this whole dynamic internally is a dynamic that's sort of founded on conflict from what what actually happens inside of me. So to make it simple is something like being angry. So in general, we think being angry is not the right thing, but anger happens constantly. So there's a conflict in me that may be born of the broader conditioning in society that I live in, but also just personally my own wish or feeling to be in a certain peace or state of well-being denies certain elements of my experience. So the denial of certain elements of my experience is the sort of internal conflict. Conflict in an external sense is more generalized as prejudice, stereotypes, the ideas that I have about you because of where you're from, because of how you speak, what you say, how you behave. And those things are based on knowledge in the sense that what I've learned about where you are, what you say, where you're from, how we interact. So those can be societal based, but those can also be based on how we interacted yesterday. So that's sort of the relationship between conflict and knowledge is in the sense there's a yesterday component, but there's also an evolutionary component. You say something to me yesterday and it hurt me, and that hurt is recorded, and that knowledge lives in me, so our relationship today has some color of it because of our interaction yesterday. So that's sort of a yesterday, a short-term component. Long-term, evolutionarily, which I think Yap brought in, is racism is a good example, that there seems to be a biological component to how we relate to one another as beings that's built into the physiological, physical system of the body. And these things are beyond, these things come before you and I even meet one another. So there's a sense that somehow that knowledge fills a space between us, and that though that could be an evolutionary shortcut that may help us to relate in some ways, it could be a shortcoming that may inhibit us for relating in others. So that's something that I notice and that I think is a recurring thing through this presentation, is what may be a shortcut for the brain in many ways is a shortcoming in others. And that's one of the, I think that's sort of a key component to how we distinguish what it means, what we may, is it possible for the brain to be free of the shortcomings of its shortcuts? That something like that. No. So again, so just to point out, I have quotes here. I'm not always going to read them, but they're here to just sort of support what I'm saying. I'm sort of more pointing out the general idea of these things. Sometimes I'll read, sometimes I won't. That's. Yeah. So, in terms of a brain that is sort of evolutionarily built to have these shortcuts and to know how to relate to its environment and those around it, the known can be very valuable, but also the environment and the people in it are constantly changing. And that, I think we can agree, is a fact. If there may not be anything that's actually static, except for our knowledge about what we are and where we live. So somehow the brain's ability to store and accumulate knowledge about what it is, where it is, and who it's relating to is valuable on some level. But in many ways, it may inhibit the reception of new information at a deep level. So this seems to be another reason why looking into the possibility of a brain being free from the known could be important, because there may be components of our issues, either personally or globally, that we miss because we know from looking at the brain, the brain tends to see what it expects to see. And this is a direct sort of this is directly because of the fact that that the brain is used to using knowledge as a way to interact with the world. So if the brain is conditioned to see what it expects to see, does it always see what it needs to see to have the right information to respond directly to what's going on? So again, this is another reason why being free from the known may be an interesting thing to ask. So a general and common component of Krishnamurti's work is the direct relationship between an individual and the entire society to which it belongs. So the way that I've sort of worded it here is that in our lives, to some of us, the problem is ourselves. So we think we have a psychological issue, or we think we aren't good enough in this area, or we've failed in this or that area. To some of us, the problem is society. So society, we live in a society that has done this or that incorrectly. So the claim that Krishnamurti makes, and the question that we can ask ourselves, is whether or not the factor of both of those has a common element in the fact that the brain tends to function out of its accumulated knowledge. So is it that my personal problems and the problems of the world somehow have a common element in that the root of the issues are the brain that attempts to solve them is somehow mostly caught in what it only knows about what it's seen before, and can't quite comprehend a problem that it's never seen before. That may be personal, that may be global, but it's somehow that it's a question of how knowledge acts in the present, in the world, both personally and globally. That there's a common element in how knowledge functions. And then we'll look at this more, but I think it's a really coming to the root of where the distinguishing or the divisive power of knowledge really comes to the forefront, is how it impacts how we relate to one another. So we'll unpack it a bit more when we go into knowledge more specifically, but there's in Krishnamurti's work, there are different classes of knowledge, and some classes of knowledge are functional and absolutely necessary. So there's never at any point any complete denial of the fact that knowledge has a very real place in the life of human beings, but that particularly in regard to how we relate to one another, knowledge seems to be problematic. And it seems to be not only in terms of this yesterday knowledge, that you say something to me yesterday that hurts, and I carry that with me, and that informs our relationship, but also in terms of our evolutionary knowledge about who is who is who is a part of you and who is not a part of you, or who is allowed in your group and who is not allowed in your group. So it's not only a personal short-term kind of knowledge, but a really long-term relational kind of knowledge that we may not even realize is functioning, because we're sort of built to be related in this way. We're, as social beings, we've developed to take so many cues and to relate to one another through so many different kinds of information. And that information is stored and in many ways can be valuable. But in terms of our direct relationship with one another, it may, how do you say? It may move beyond its functional bounds into realms that end up restricting our actual relationship. Something like that. So in general, these are just like some components of Krishnamurti's teachings. Why ask the question, given the fact that we know that the brain functions by accumulating knowledge and thus being able to interact with it with its environment in better ways? Are there areas, or is there a way in which this function moves beyond its functional capacity into realms that it ends up becoming problematic and dangerous? So I put this slide because I thought it was interesting, just in terms of my research and looking at these terms. These are not really defining what Krishnamurti meant, but more pointing out that when Krishnamurti spoke about the known and freedom, he's really speaking about it in quite a different way than we commonly speak about when we say these words. So just to sort of go through these, in terms of knowledge, this first section is really sort of what knowledge is that it's the accumulation of experience. And this is not only your personal experience, but it also includes all the knowledge that you've learned from other people, reading books, cultural knowledge that you've soaked up unconsciously, and knowledge even you could include that you absorbed in the womb from the environment. So somehow that knowledge is the sum total of the organism's software to function in an environment. Often in Krishnamurti's work, the known is synonymous with the past. And really, I think what this points out is that there's a component of how we interact with our world in the present that is directly related to what we know about ourselves and about our world from the past. So all of our experiences from the past are constantly informing how we interact with the present. Another important thing to mention is that very often Krishnamurti mentions that the known and knowledge is stored in the brain cells. And I think that's important because it really means that this is something physical. So knowledge is a physical thing that functions in the world, and it lives in the brain, but not only the brain, but the body also. And then why I think that's important is what Yap hinted at in his introduction, is that even that knowledge isn't just a functional sort of dictionary-like thing living in the brain. It lives in the nerves and it lives in the cells, and it has a feeling component. And that's really comes into play when you realize how it acts in the present. So your knowledge about me isn't just a dictionary-like book knowledge. It has a feeling component, and that's why and how it interacts in the present. And it has a direct relationship to how we interact. So I think that's also a sort of a critical bit. These other bits are just more like attributes, common attributes that show up quite often in Krishnamurti's work. That knowledge is always limited and always partial, which I think is not always understood. That somehow the brain doesn't necessarily see that knowledge is limited. So we often act as though the knowledge that we have is the complete picture, though the possibility of a complete picture built out of knowledge may not even be tenable. Another thing to point out is that there's a sort of a dual element to knowledge, in the sense that it's absolutely necessary to survive. You need to know how to get home. You need to know your name. You need to know who you are related to. You need to know how to eat, what to eat. There's functional knowledge. You need to know how to perform your job. So this kind of knowledge is not really necessarily called into question in terms of Krishnamurti's work, and we'll go into that more when we unpack what knowledge is. But somehow it's just to say that knowledge has different components, there's different classes of knowledge, and there's nowhere any sum total denial of knowledge, that one has to be sort of a blank. There's a difference, there's no sort of implication that one needs to be a blank slate, that there's a state of blank slateness. Simultaneously with the fact that knowledge is necessary, knowledge is divisive and fragmentary, partially because it is always and only partial, that knowledge itself can only present part of a picture, but also specifically in terms of how we relate to one another. So specifically in terms of our relationship, knowledge can be divisive. Often in terms of how we relate to one another, what we remember about one another is our initial meeting point, and that isn't necessarily always a direct relationship. So to move to freedom, these are more, again, just to point out that what Krishnamurti speaks about freedom is not what we tend to think of. So really, as a general idea, freedom in the way that Krishnamurti speaks about it is a kind of ending, which is not really how we look at freedom in general. I've put it here as an ending of conflict, and again, that's one of the first places we started. And I think that's one of the cruxes of why the question of freedom from the known is even important, because like I said, we take conflict for granted so basically, but the proposal here is that there's a possibility of the complete ending of that. And so what that is a kind of freedom that's different than what we typically assume freedom is. The second one also I think is interesting, that freedom is denied by desire. So often, and especially in society, freedom is seen as a sort of an ability to choose what you desire to choose. So the more choices you have and the freedom that you have to avail yourselves of what you want or what you desire is seen as a kind of freedom. And that, in a way, is antithetical to what Krishnamurti is speaking about freedom. Because that freedom itself is conditioned by what you're conditioned to choose. So it's subtle, but it's a clear distinction that he makes, that your freedom to choose is a direct sort of consequence of how you're bound to your choices that you're conditioned to make. So with that, we'll move on, and we're going to go into sort of unpack in more detail what Krishnamurti means by the known and freedom. So I hope that it moves in the right way. Yes. So this is just repeating what Jaap brought out in the first slide, which is sort of a general summary of what we're saying Krishnamurti means by the known. And so what I'm going to do is essentially go through different components of the known, or different elements of what Krishnamurti means by the known. And there's, just to say that the one of these sections is a video, so there's a 6-minute clip that I'm going to play. So that will be coming up at a certain point. I thought it would be interesting to bring in Krishnamurti's notion of consciousness, because in many ways it is analogous to what Krishnamurti means by knowledge and the known. But why it's interesting is that it's actually very different than our common understanding of what consciousness is. And the difference is exactly the difference to our common understanding of what knowledge is. And I'll point that out here. So, sorry, that may be a bit difficult to read, but I'll read it aloud. In our common definitions of consciousness and knowledge, there is always an assumed entity that consciousness or knowledge belongs to. With Krishnamurti's work, that is not the case. This assumed entity that consciousness or knowledge would belong to is itself only and always built out of the consciousness and knowledge that it thinks it owns. So there's never a distinction between the owner of knowledge and the knowledge that it owns. That in itself is a whole, a sum total, that is itself knowledge. The same with consciousness. So consciousness itself is the sum total of the content of the movement of your mind, which includes what you think you know, but also the one that thinks it knows. So I'll just read this quote because I think it sort of lays this out well. The content of consciousness is consciousness. What you are, content. What you think, what you feel, what you believe, what you are attached to, your beliefs, fears, pleasures, superstitions, all that is your content. That is your consciousness. Please look at it. At yourself through the description which the speaker is describing, bearing in mind the description is not the described. The word is not the thing. The content of consciousness, which is you, is the known. The known is the me, my desires, my pursuits, my ambitions, my fears, my demands for success. The me that is constantly imitating, conforming. That is the content of consciousness of every human being. So I think it's really important because we'll unpack again what the sort of divisive, dangerous element of consciousness is, or the known is. And it seems to come to this component that we've sort of grown up with and developed with, that somehow there's an entity separate from and aware of what it knows and how it feels, that can act on and deal with what it knows and how it feels. the sort of the claim here is that that very essential distinction is the root of why knowledge can be conflictual and divisive, because and I guess the reason for the conflict is that this distinction may very well be incorrect, but the fact of it being incorrect is not seen or observed or understood. So it continues to act and has power because of not only because of its assumed reality, but because of its inability to be directly perceived or directly seen. So, what gives knowledge its power, but also memory its utility, is the fact that it functions in the present. So again, there's no full blanket denial of the fact that knowledge is valuable. But the reason knowledge is valuable and the reason that memories are valuable is that they actually act in the present. You remember where you live right now, so you can go there now, which is a very functional, real, living value to what memory is. But at the same time, again, this shortcut to memory is its shortcoming. So you remember what happened yesterday between you and a friend, and that remembrance may color and affect how you relate to them today. And that may, in turn, affect how you relate to them forever. And those memories may not be the best way for us to relate to one another. So there's a value and a danger in how knowledge acts, but the point is that it's active in the present. So knowledge is not a dead thing that just lives in the past that you can recall when you desire, but it's an active process that's so deeply built into who you are and how you interact with the world that it's a sort of a functional thing that revitalizes itself actively in the present. So very often, Krishnamurti brings out the point that the brain needs order to function, that one of the brain's primary functions is to create a sort of a homeostatic environment within itself. So order is required for the brain to be able to live and function and interpret its environment in a way that it feels comfortable to do so. The difficulty is that this order seems to be primarily built out of what it knows from before. So it may not always be correct. And there seems to be this strange way in which the brain uses quite a lot of its 25 watts in a balancing act that it's learned from the past. So I have a collection of experiences that I remember as good and profound or interesting, and those I hold on to and long for. I also have a collection of memories that are bad or negative or hurtful, and those I build techniques to avoid and deny. So there's a whole host, there's a sort of a network of expenditure of energy in attempting to navigate my experience through the past experiences that I've had. And essentially there's a claim that's an enormous amount of energy spent in navigating my present experience based on what I think the right experience right now should be, which is based on my good and bad experiences in the past. So the question is whether or not that energy is necessary, and whether or not that's the right way to sort of, am I actually available for the possible experience that I'm currently having, or am I always and only navigating my current experience based on my good and bad experiences of the past. The other interesting thing here to note, which is not, I don't think is necessarily a common sense for us, is that somehow the implication is that that which I just laid out is the way that the brain typically looks for security and order. A constant navigation of one's experience to turn poor experiences into good ones and good experiences into ones that last. So there's this constant sort of manipulation of one's experiences to maintain a certain order. The suggestion is that that whole expenditure of energy actually, if you look at it, is based on an insecure notion, in the sense that there's a constant need for your involvement in your own experience to keep that order. So there may be a kind of security that has nothing to do with the manipulation of one's experience, that's beyond manipulating one's experience, and that seems to come out of an understanding of the limits of knowledge. So to see that knowledge is the factor of your own manipulation of your experience may be a different kind of security that's founded in something that's beyond your own limited experience of your past. So I think that moves us on to video. Yes, so then in this slide and the next, we're sort of slowly moving closer, approximating to what is the component of knowledge that seems to be the real issue. And so we're zooming into the difference between what Krishnamurti would call a functional or physical knowledge, which is your knowledge of your job, technical knowledge, scientific knowledge, these sorts of things. And a knowledge that's usually called psychological, which really has to do with your knowledge about yourself and the knowledge that functions as you, who you think you are. So this is a 6-minute clip that will hopefully play on its own. That's a conversation between Krishnamurti and David Bohm, and they sort of just pull this out, and Krishnamurti's pushing to understand why is it that this knowledge, if it even is problematic, that it continues to function. So I thought it was interesting just to point out this distinction.
So, for example, I'd like to go on differently. You're a scientist. To discover something new, you must have certain emptiness from which there is different perception.
Yes, but you see, I think that there's a difference in the sense that usually the question is limited, you see.
Yes.
And say the mind may be empty with regard to that question.
Particular question, yes.
And allowing for discovery and insight in that question, right?
But can that mind, which has been specialized and therefore inquiring into something, it becomes empty, and that emptiness, from that emptiness you discover something new. I understand that. But without any specialization, does this emptiness hold every other? I don't know.
Yes, well, I think that we have to ask that we are not questioning a particular area,
Yes.
but
Yes.
rather we are questioning the whole of knowledge.
Knowledge, yes.
And,
yes. It's the most extraordinary coming to it.
And that's, as you were saying, the end of knowledge, you see,
Yeah.
as the Vedanta.
That's the real answer.
Mm-hmm. But if a person can take this scientific attitude in
section, so I'm going to make sure that it plays the right section.
It's the most extraordinary coming to it.
And that's, as you were saying, the end of knowledge, you see.
Yeah. But apparently very, very, very few people do end knowledge and talk from freedom.
Well, I would come back to that point and say that seems, for knowledge generally seems extremely important, worth holding on to. You see, though a person may verbally say it should end.
But, and you
That's
mean,
knowledge about the self.
Yes, you mean I am so stupid that I don't see that this knowledge has very little significance, essentially, psychological knowledge, and yet my mind clings to it.
Yes, I wouldn't quite put it that the person is that stupid, but rather to say that this knowledge stupefies the brain, you see.
Yes, all right, call it.
I mean that the brain, being caught in this knowledge, becomes stupefied.
All right, but it doesn't seem to extricate itself.
Well, because it's already so stupefied that it can't see what it's doing, right?
So what shall it do? I've been watching this many years. Why human beings think or attempt to become free from certain things, and yet this is the root of it. You know, this accumulation, psychological accumulation, which becomes psychological knowledge, and so it divides and all kinds of things happen around it and within it. And yet the mind refuses to let go.
Yes.
Is it that doesn't see or it has given to knowledge such immense importance?
That's what I mean, yes.
Why? Is that because there is safety in it?
Well,
there
that's
is
part of it.
security in it?
Well, that's part of it, but that it seems to be a source of security. But see, I think in some way knowledge has taken on the significance of the absolute. You see, to say that knowledge should be properly relative. Now, but this knowledge of the mind, the psychological knowledge of the self, or the associated knowledge of religion.
I understand all that, sir, but you're not answering my question.
Right.
I'm an ordinary man. I realize all this, and I realize the significance and the value of knowledge in different levels. But deeper down inside one, this knowledge, this accumulated knowledge, is very, very destructive.
That's true, but there's self-deception. The knowledge deceives the mind, so a person is not usually aware that it is destructive.
Is that why human beings cling to it?
Well, they can't really. By the time you see it, we don't know exactly how they got started on it, but once it got started, the mind is generally in a state in which it is not able to look at this because it is avoiding the question. It is there's a tremendous defensive mechanism to escape looking at the whole question.
Why?
Because it seems something supremely precious might be at stake.
You see, no, one is strangely intelligent in other directions, capable and efficient, skill, have greater skill. But here, where the root of all this, of trouble is this: why don't we comprehend it fully? What prevents the mind? You say it has given importance to knowledge. I acknowledge that. It is so, and yet it holds on. You must know. You.
Well, but I think that once this has happened, there's a mechanical process that resists intelligence. See that.
So what shall I do? What shall I do as an ordinary man? I realized technological knowledge and all that, but the knowledge which I've accumulated, which is divisive, which is destructive, which is rather petty, and yet I hold on to that. And I realize I must let it go, but I can't. What shall I do? I think this is the average person's problem. A problem which arises when we're a little bit serious about all this. Is it the lack of energy?
Not primarily. You see, the energy is being dissipated by this process.
I understand that. Having dissipated a great deal of energy, I haven't got the energy to.
But that could come back quickly.
Grapple with this?
No, that could come back quickly if we could get out of this. You see, the energy is constantly being dissipated, and a person may be a little worn down, but he could recover if this would stop. I don't think it's the main point.
No, that's not the main point.
Yeah.
So what shall I do as a human being, realizing that I have this knowledge is naturally, inevitably forming a groove in which I live. My next question is, how am I to break it down?
Well, I'm not sure that it's clear, say, that in general, that for people that this knowledge is doing all this, and also that the knowledge is knowledge. You see, it may seem to be some being, the self, the me. There's a certain, this knowledge is experienced as some entity. That this knowledge creates the me,
Yes.
and
Yes.
the me is now experienced as an entity, which is not knowledge, but some real being, right?
Are you saying this being is different from knowledge?
It appears to be. It makes itself, it feigns difference, you see.
But is it?
It isn't, but it has a very powerful ability to...
But that has been my condition.
That's true. Now the question is, how do we get through that to break down
That is the real point, you see.
Because it creates an imitation or a pretension of a state of being, right?
Always following a certain...
I think this will, yeah, this works. Sorry. So just to follow that up and to sort of, that leads us into moving into discussing freedom. This distinguishing factor between what is functional and what is psychological knowledge. So often Krishnamurti talks about the right place for knowledge, and somehow that seems to be born of an understanding of the limits of the functional knowledge, and where knowledge and its action tend to move in a direction that becomes psychological. So memories and ideas are stored as an entity that can then work on ideas and memories in the brain, and this entity, this psychological being, is where knowledge becomes dangerous. So with that, we'll move on to freedom. So yeah, again, this is the same from Jaap's introduction. basically, freedom refers to, K refers to the process in which the brain's responses to contemporaneous events is not necessarily influenced or conditioned by the known. But this is specifically in relationship to what is deemed psychological knowledge. So freedom from this entity that assumes it has the ability to act upon knowledge and states of the mind. So we move on to what exactly is Krishnamurti talking about in terms of what is psychological. So the fact is, your entire structure, both physiologically as well as psychologically, is conditioned. If there is an independent entity apart from the structure, what is that entity? It must be created by the same structure. There is no entity apart from the structure. I may project myself outside the structure and imagine that it is an independent entity, but it is still a part of the structure of the process of thinking. So somehow there's a misinterpretation of what action is, especially in terms of my own ability to interfere with my experiences and my mind. And this is basically, essentially what Krishnamurti is pointing out as psychological knowledge. And to zoom in even more than that, I think we could say that what is psychological really is, and the movement of desire and will. That somehow there's a constant activity of the avoidance of pain, the pursuit of pleasure, and this movement of the mind is what is deemed as psychological. So it's not that it's anything separate from physical, but more that there's a subset of knowledge that is rooted in an activity born of desire that is deemed as psychological. So this is somehow an attempt to zoom in on what is meant by psychological. It's not necessarily not physical. It's more has to do with this activity of a me that feels it is an actor in the realm of knowledge and experience. So a sort of a key component of this actor in the realm of experience, and the reason that it has a tendency to create conflict, is called many things: psychological time, the factor of becoming. It's basically this, that you have a certain experience, and in some way that experience is unsatisfactory. So out of that sense of unsatisfactoriness, there's a projection of what the experience should be or would be or can be. And that projection is something that this psychological being can move towards within its own bounds. And that is essentially what's considered to be psychological time. So there's this assumed entity within knowledge assumes it's acting as it projects a future state that it can move towards. And as we'll unpack later when we get into perception, that what we assume is action is merely a kind of reaction that's born out of what we already know and understand about ourselves. So the fact of our jealousy is the root of what we feel would be like to be not jealous. So we create a state that's not jealous, but that state itself is a picture that we paint that's sort of only and always in opposition to what it feels like to be jealous. And we as an entity within our own selves paint that picture and move towards it. It gives us a sense of volition. We feel as though we're moving towards something. It feels active, and it feels as though we're doing something and we are changing. But somehow the suggestion is that because what we're moving towards is only and always based on what we already are, we're not actually really going anywhere. So there's a distinction between reaction and what a real action is. And we're sort of slowly moving towards what action may be if it's not just simply a reaction to what's already going on. So another distinction in terms of freedom, which is one that I think we come up against just in terms of our common understanding, is that freedom from something is actually only a reaction to something, which is kind of related to what this sort of psychological journey. You could look at jealousy again. So one may develop a technique to be free from a reaction of jealousy, but that technique itself is something that I must hold on to and continue to repeat. So in a sense, that quasi-freedom requires that I build a chain of reactions to avoid certain experiences that I may or may not have. So this freedom, a freedom from something actually only builds a tighter network of reactions that is itself not actually free. So then, what exactly is freedom if freedom is not from something? And so I thought it's interesting because the points where Krishnamurti speaks most directly about what freedom is, they all point to the ending of something. And the ending is really this movement or dynamic, this process of moving from something that is occurring to something that should be or will be occurring. So it's the ending of a movement of desiring or any sort of aversion to what's occurring. So freedom means the ending of the observer, because the observer is all tradition, established order, social acceptance, morality. It's the ending of the self, the images I have about myself, and then when the brain is free, only then is there supreme intelligence. And again, freedom is the ending completely of becoming something. So somehow freedom isn't something that is, freedom isn't a state that's achieved, that then new kinds of experience happen within. It's almost it's the ending of the necessity for experiencing at all. It's the ending of the necessity for certain kinds of experiences versus others. So slowly we're moving towards the quote-unquote how, or what it means to move towards this freedom. And a constant theme is perception of what is. So instead of this activity of recognition of my current state, be it anger or frustration, jealousy, envy, is there a way that can be total in itself without my interaction or manipulation of it at all? It's worded in the sense that can I be aware of this, or can I observe? But that's difficult to state, because often when we attempt to observe or look, the observer or the looker has some quality of judgment or interpretation of the experience. So what this really is that somehow is there's absolutely no critique or preconceived condition upon any kind of experience, moment to moment. So then we move to how. So it's interesting because in a way we separated this into different components, but really these are not different things. It's like looking at something from different points of view, or discussing a kind of quality of mind from different angles. So I think that's kind of the way to look at how we unpack this. So this idea of negation comes up in Krishnamurti's work, and I think that a way to look at it is to go back to when we discussed this idea of projecting a new state that you can move towards. So if you're in a state of dis-ease or uncomfortableness, that's typically the root of when we project some state of enlightenment or perfection or feeling better that we can move towards. There's a certain security in that, because in that motion, I know what I'm moving towards. And in that sense that there's a projection that's made out of me, that's considered to be a positive action. So I know what peace would look and feel like, and I look towards that and I move towards that. I manipulate my experience. I attempt to manipulate my environment so that I closer and closer approximate what I know peace or love feels and looks like. Negation is the denial of that activity altogether. So to see that moving towards anything requires that I know something about it from the very beginning, so that the truth is that in moving towards anything, I'm only moving towards my own projection of what I assume is at the end of my goal. This idea of negation is somehow to see that whole activity as an activity and consistently deny it as it attempts to move. So negation is sort of the denial of reaction against what is. So a few quotes, and really it's to say that you cannot have freedom as a positive act, which is basically to say that to have freedom as a positive act, to move towards freedom, one would necessarily have to have an idea of what freedom was to be able to take the steps to get there. And if freedom is something actually, it can't be a projection of our non-freedom. So a component of this sort of, it's in a way the same thing, but you could look at it differently. There's a possibility of the mind that sees that if it's attempting to move in any direction, it's choosing for or against certain experiences. So that choice in itself is already sort of built into the program. So is it possible for there to be no choice at all? And somehow this absence of choice is related to this non-projective movement. There's an active quality to being aware of what's going on, and without choice there's no movement away or against what's occurring. And this, I think, so this move brings us to what Krishnamurti speaks about in terms of perception. And I think this is one of the most interesting bits and something that is difficult to understand in our common terms, because really what Krishnamurti means by perception is that the act of perception is itself the value of perception. What's perceived is not important. So there's something about perception itself that itself has value in it of itself, because it's not related to or dependent on what is perceived. And again, I'm trying to think of a way to sort of respond to this idea of there being a circular thing about freedom and perception. But in a way, I think that the circular bit is more a consequence of how we look at how we understand what it means to act and therefore have a consequence. But that freedom and perception really are not two things. They're not one before the other, but that freedom and perception are themselves one action. And that Krishnamurti proposes that real action itself is perception. It's not about what's perceived, but the very act of perception, which is not born out of previous knowledge. That action has value, and that value itself is because it is its action somehow in itself. Yeah, so hopefully we can look at that more, because I think as a conversation that's really interesting. And then I think we have one more clip after this. Yeah. So this is the ending clip. I thought this was a really interesting conversation just about this process. And yeah, so hopefully this one will start where it's supposed to.
And the divine.
I'll check.
Why is there this division?
No.
Or
between the outside and the inside.
no more
Everyone is responsible.
no more within consciousness.
No more fragmentation. No
No,
more
that's
observer.
very important to understand, sir.
No more observer
No,
separate from
yes,
his observed.
which means what? No fragmentation within consciousness.
Yes, sir.
Which means consciousness only exists when there is conflict between fragments.
I'm not sure that we have understood this.
Well,
Consciousness is its fragments.
Consciousness is its fragments, and consciousness is the battle between the fragments.
Are you saying, sir, that they are only fragments because they battle?
And when
they are not battling together, they are not fragments.
they're not fragments.
Because they are not acting as parts. The acting of one part on another
ceases.
That is what it means when you say fragmentation.
Yeah.
That's what fragmentation is.
So see what has taken place, sir?
So the fragments disappear when they're not acting against each other.
Naturally.
Yes.
When Pakistan and India
Are no longer fighting.
there
is no more Pakistan and India.
India.
Yes. Yes.
Hmm?
Yes.
Of course, naturally, sir. Yes, yes.
This is an enormous thing, sir. Are you saying, sir, that is the change?
Wait. I don't know yet. We are going into it. So I am human mind which has realized this, that the world is me and I am the world.
Yes.
My consciousness is the consciousness of the world, and the world's consciousness is me. The content of the consciousness, with all its misery, etc., so on, is consciousness.
Yes.
And within that consciousness, there are 1,000 fragmentations.
Yes, sir.
One fragment of those many fragments becomes the authority,
Yes.
the censor,
Yes.
the observer, the
Yes.
examiner, the thinker,
The boss.
the boss.
Yes.
And so he maintains fragmentation.
Yes. Because he maintains the vision.
See the important moment he assumes the authority, he must maintain fragmentation.
Yes, sir. Obviously. Because it's a part of consciousness acting on the rest of consciousness.
Therefore, he must maintain conflict.
Yes, sir.
And conflict is consciousness.
You have said that fragments are consciousness, sir. And are you saying now that fragments are in fact that content?
Of course.
Fragments are conflict.
Yeah.
And there's no
Whenever-
fragment without conflict.
When is consciousness active?
When it is in conflict.
Of course, obviously.
Yes, sir.
Otherwise,
Yes, sir.
there's freedom. There's freedom to observe.
Yes, sir.
So, radical revolution in consciousness and of consciousness takes place when there is no conflict at all.
Thank you, sir.
That's the end. Thank you. That's the beginning, yeah.
I think we can do some questions now for those who have questions.
Do we want to let people take a little break first?
Do we have 10 minutes? Good, and then, or because we have only 1 o'clock, it's we're going to break at 1. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So 10 minutes, and then we do questions, or
Yeah, that's fine. I'm fine either way.